Crimson Cast. Galen, Clavio joining you as we continue to wind through championship week as Indiana getting set to take on Miami in the national championship game. Taylor, we were just musing about this before we got the podcast started, and I know the fans are probably tired of hearing about this, but man, it's still hard to get your head wrapped around this. It's really a remarkable story for Indiana, and it's great to be a part of covering this in some way, shape, or form.
I'm used to us just talking about like the 11th game of the season, Galen. And so when I sat down, I'm like, all right, previewing the national championship on Crimson Cast. What?
It is, just another day at the office, right? For you and me. But I mean, one of the joys of this whole process has been we've been able to continue to talk about IU football for as long as we have. This is the latest we've talked about IU football, I think. Well, not I think, I know, ever. And it's funny to me as well because someone, I forget, and I apologize for who did this because I forgot, because there's been just a flurry of tweets and texts and everything. I've not been able to keep up on the communications, but someone decided they were going to go back and listen to the post-game Akron podcast from 2023. And I went back, like I couldn't help myself. I went back and listened to a little bit of it, and I was like, I had to stop after 2 or 3 minutes. I was like, I do not want to go back into that headspace. Like I need to keep things as optimistic and excited and happy as I can. And it is, though, amazing when you sit down and think about it, just how far Indiana has come in such a short period of time. I talked about this with Connor Hitchcock earlier on one of the previous podcasts. It's been so quick. And you and I have been through a lot of coverage of games. We've talked about this stuff for a long time. And I think what's most fascinating is what you brought to the table in terms of data analysis and what a team should strive for in terms of efficiency, in terms of all these things. Like Indiana does that and does it as well, if not better, than anybody in the country. So it's not just that Indiana's winning and at this high level and about to play in the national championship, but all the things that you started talking to IU fans about a few years ago when you started Bite-Sized Bison, like this was the direction that, it's like ideally, theoretically, this is the way you should be going. And that's exactly what's happened.
Yeah, it is bizarre. Like even it's as bizarre as it is, this profile of a team is a team that should be in the national championship. It just happens to have Indiana's logo next to it. And that's, like, in that, I know I listened to a podcast that you did earlier this week. I can't remember who it was with now, but you were talking about how you're kind of scared to look at the number. Oh, it was Matt Dollinger. You're kind of scared to look at the numbers sometimes, and they're not even scared, but like uncomfortable looking at the numbers because, it's not supposed to be Indiana doing this. And yet, here we are. And that was kind of, I released the last Bite-Sized Bison earlier this week. And, when I started, I was like, man, I'm going to write the preview for the national championship game, and Indiana's in it. And I was like, I can't write this without recognizing some of the things that happened before all of this. And how the whole thing is like, the story is bigger than what's happened since December 2023. It's everything before that, both for Indiana and for Curt Cignetti, and how those two paths, they converged in December 2023 at just like the perfect time. And it's and it happened in Bloomington, and I think that's the wild part.
And we were here to talk about it and cover it, and that's been really special. I mean, I think it's only, for me, this has been a week of reflection in a lot of ways. And, it's tough because it's over. I'd like the next game to start like right after the last game's over. Like, I just want to let's get back on it. Let's do it. You get some extra days, obviously, between the Peach Bowl semifinal and the national championship. And it's good for the players. They get healthy. It's good for the coaches. They get some more time to scout. For fans and for people that comment on the team, it's a lot to just focus on one game because that's it. Like, that's all that there is left in the entire college football season. But I've really reflected a lot, as it turned out you did at the start of Bite-Sized Bison, which, again, everybody should go check out and read. It takes you a while to read. It's a lengthy It's not bite size. Let's put it that way. This is the Sam's Club version of bite sized bison, the Costco version of bite sized bison. But to reflect back on all of the things that as an IU observer you've seen, or as an IU fan you've experienced, is a really fascinating emotional voyage. Because and I think it's made even more fascinating by the lack of gradual rise that this has felt like. And it's not entirely the case, because obviously there was a lot that happened between Fred Glass really making a decision to commit financially to football and hiring Kevin Wilson in 2010, and where we are now. The last few years of the Allen era really made it feel like the program went all the way backwards, but in reality it didn't. It laid groundwork, but none of what we saw there would have prepared us for what we see now. And I think that's been the thing that for fans, it's been intoxicating, because it's happened so quickly, but it's also been hard to get your head wrapped around, because as you know, from having covered Ohio State previously and having observed this sport, it's just not normal what's gone on here.
Yeah, and one thing I remember, I was covering Indiana in 2019 when they, Caleb DeBoer was the offensive coordinator. They were having that, pretty solid season. I remember, I think I might have been talking to Zach Osterman about this, and it was about, Indiana wasn't losing the games it shouldn't lose. Like they were staying above a certain baseline, and that included going to Nebraska and beating Nebraska, which was wild.
Yes.
But they were staying in that, that middle ground, that signal that they were rising as a program.
Right.
And that, that included losing to some of the teams that they've beaten this year, or the quality of teams they've beaten this year. And so, even back then, when it was pretty clear that they were rising as a program, that there was rumbling of interest underneath the surface for Indiana football and the fan base, even then, that seemed like leagues away. Like they were still in a different existence than the teams that competed in games like this. And that's, I think that's what you're talking, that kind of touches on what you're talking about, because there was a gradual rise, and it just, I don't know if anybody believed necessarily that it would get here.
Right.
And then, like you were saying, just to suddenly, change and, move up several tiers as a football program is pretty jarring. And some of the things I was writing in the Bite-Sized Bison, I'm like, this was not that long ago. Akron, 4 overtimes, that was 2023, man. Like this is it's wild.
I've got a chart that you put on your site that highlights all of this. But before we get to that, just a reminder, we're brought to you by Home Field Apparel, a place to go for the finest in college fashions, the softest fabrics, the coolest designs, and the hosts, along with Modelo, of the Can't Miss Kickoff Tour. And we'll be there too, along with IU Alumni Association. Home Field at the National Championship happening throughout the course of the weekend coming up here in South Florida. A couple of events I want to highlight. First of all, the Welcome to Miami Party and Pop-Up Shop event at American Social in Brickell on Saturday, the 17th of January, 6 to 9 p.m. Official welcome party, IU freebies and giveaways while supplies last, drink specials for the first 200 of age fans, and a 20% online discount for attendees in Rose and Peach Bowl Home Field IU apparel. And then the big one for us, Crimson Cast Live, happening at Mickey Burke's in South Beach, 1265 Washington Avenue, Sunday, January 18th, 7 to 10 p.m. This is our official Crimson Cast Stampede to Miami party and live show. There again will be freebies and giveaways, a pop-up shop from Home Field Modelo, drink specials, 20% discount if you're in any Home Field gear. And we'll be doing a live show. We've got some special guests lined up, and we look forward to seeing all of you folks out there. And thank you to Alex Paul for this graphic. We've got Stampede 3. It is the Bison invasion of South Florida. Alex driving down. He's actually already on the road. He had to leave early. I could not because of work obligations. Our buddy Mitchell Page, occasional Crimson Cast contributor, is driving down separately. And then I will be bringing it through the skies. I will be conducting the Bison airlift, and I'm looking forward to that. So we will be converging on South Florida on Friday, and we hope to see you folks down there. One other event I don't have a graphic for you yet, but I'm going to be putting out on Monday. We're going to have another social event, 11:30 to 2:30 at American Social in Fort Lauderdale. So that is a day of event. I need something to do to keep myself from just nervously pacing up and down the beach for 6 hours. So if you're in Broward County, if you're in Fort Lauderdale, if you're in Palm Beach County, if you're looking for something to do early before the festivities get started at Hard Rock, come on up to Fort Lauderdale, American Social in Fort Lauderdale on Las Olas, and we'll be there 11:30 to 2:30. Let's get as many Crimson Cast and Back Home Network fans out as we can for that. All right. Let's dive in. Taylor, let me start with the chart that I think that illustrates the point you were just making, which is the one that Bill Rajewski had on collegefootballdata.com.
Yep.
So this is the ELO. Explain first, what is ELO?
ELO is essentially SP plus. It's basically a power metric, and basically, you know, the higher it is, the better the team is. The lower it is, the worse it is.
It takes into account your position, your opponent's position, who you beat. It's actually a chess. It's a way of measuring chess metrics.
Yeah.
That's where the math came from. But this is something where you can trace the entire history of a program, because even though we don't have SP plus data that goes back far enough to really account for certain things, we do have this. And you can see, like, you know, the prior peaks, there was a peak in like 1905, back in the James Horn, Jimmy Sheldon days. I think Jimmy Sheldon might have been the coach during that. He might have been a little later. A pretty big trough. Bo McMillan builds the team up, and they hit the high water mark previously, which was the 1945 season. Then it falls off when Bo McMillan leaves. It's a rough 40s. It's a rough 50s. And even the 67 Rose Bowl year for Indiana, as historically vaunted as that season was, that was a pretty average season where the team got really lucky with a lot of results. And
it's crazy how average that ELO rating is. That is, yeah.
It is basically at the historical middle for what Indiana's done. And that's actually, well, that's I think 1500 ELO is like the baseline for the entirety of college football. So it was, as much as we remember that era, like those 80s Mallory teams, the ones that went to bowls were generally better against the rest of college football than what you had in that 67 Rose Bowl season. It just goes to show there's some luck involved, even when you're good, of being able to take full advantage. Then we know how up and down, mostly down, the 90s got. The 2000s, you had a little peak there at the beginning, and then a lot of down times. And then it really did take that gradual build that you're talking about from about 2013 up to that 2019-2020 season, or those two seasons. And that felt like maybe a new plateau for IU, and then the immediate drop-off. And then you look at those last 2 years. For those of you that are not watching along, you should definitely go check this chart out on YouTube or Spotify. The rocket ship that is IU football under Curt Cignetti. I mean, this has been the most impressive thing. It's not just the wins. It's the level of efficiency that has just been imbued into this program by Cignetti and his staff and these players, and this rapid rise. I'd love to see a chart that charts this compared to what other programs have done historically, because I don't think you're going to see that many ELO jumps of that size in such a short period of time.
Yeah, no, absolutely, Galen. And I know we've talked about this before, but it's just, you know, it was just kind of an aligning of stars moment, but also the moment in college football that we're in. You know, like, not a lot of the years before, not a lot of the years on that chart had a transfer portal or NIL. You know, and so, you know, they could take essentially transplant a system and a culture into Indiana from JMU, this thing that Curt Cignetti had been building for over a decade, and bring it to Bloomington, and, you know, a proven winner. And so, of course, you know, looking back now, of course, Indiana was going to win by doing that. But this is Indiana, you know, and this is the Big Ten, and that was the Sun Belt. And so there was no guarantee. And then, you know, I don't think really many people did know outside of coaching networks just what kind of an evaluator Curt Cignetti is. And so I think that also played into it too. But, you know, just so many things, so many variables that you can't really pin down, cause that rocket ship that you were talking about on that chart. It's really a phenomenon.
Let's quickly reflect on what Indiana did against Oregon,
Yeah.
because we talked a lot before that game. I think we were both convinced that that was going to be a close game between two teams that the power ratings really liked. Oregon was either second or third, depending on which one you looked at. Um, it was not close. Indiana came out and just absolutely jumped Oregon from the beginning. Obviously, the pick six on the first play. I mean, that's about the most perfect start you can have as a college football team, is to get that kind of an advantage off your opponent's first offensive possession. Oregon then came back, looked pretty good on that first offensive drive, and did nothing else of value until garbage time set in. Watching it from the statistical and analytical lens that you watch games from, what stuck out to you the most, and how surprised were you about the way that game went?
Well, I knew that Dante Moore would turn the ball. He had turned the ball over, I believe, his last 5 games before that game. So I was anticipating some sort of turnover by him. So when that pick six happened, I was like, okay, that'll be his turnover. And then Oregon ran down, they got that score, and I was like, okay, this it's going to be close. And then the other turnovers happened, and I eventually, you know, when that type of thing happens, the analytics are out the window at that point, because it put Indiana in such an advantageous position, and they are so good when they get into the red zone. I can't even list the numbers off the top of my head right now, Galen, but Fernando Mendoza's numbers in the red zone are phenomenal for the last 2 years. Like, no interceptions, and I think it's like 38 touchdowns or something like that, maybe 28. Yeah, he's been great in the red zone. And if you give Indiana the ball that close to their goal line, that's not a good formula. So I once that happened, once Indiana got up, several scores, I was like, I don't think Oregon they needed balance. Their offense is predicated on balance, and that involves running the football. They didn't have time to run the football. They needed to pass the ball.
Right.
And once Indiana got up by 2-3 scores, I was like, okay, I don't think Oregon is tooled to come back from something like that. And so I really do think it was the turnovers that and Galen, I saw Landon Tangwell tweeted something earlier today, and I thought it was something that was really interesting that I hadn't heard from a lot of former players, which Landon Tangwell is a former Penn State offensive lineman. He said, like, looking at the tape, that he understands by watching the film why the players respond so positively to Chris Ignetti. He said Chris Ignetti's always going for the jugular. It doesn't matter. He said some of the nastiest blitzes that Bryant Haynes called in that game were in the fourth quarter. and I was like, oh my God, like Chris Ignetti and Bryant Haynes and Mike Shanahan are always going for the high value, high efficiency type of approach, regardless of what the score is. And which we knew that, but like, to see that in the college football playoff, and to tell your players that, and for your players to understand that, like, that bleeds through. I definitely think that's intentional, because you got it. You have to have that mindset anytime you're on the field.
There's a relentlessness. There's a relentlessness. Sorry, too much podcasting today. From Signetti and from Shanahan and from Haynes, and it does filter down to the players. And it's probably the greatest accomplishment from a coaching perspective that has so thoroughly been ingrained in the way that Indiana plays football. And it's probably the thing that I and you and Connor Hitchcock and all of these other people that have followed IU for so long struggle with the most, in a positive way, is Indiana, as we know, like, has this long history programmatically prior to Kirk Cincinnati getting here of playing great for 3 quarters and then getting overwhelmed in the fourth. And to watch Indiana be the team that's not only putting their foot on the accelerator, but actually getting gas into the engine at that point from doing so, it's like a body switch in the best possible way. And so I think that that's a really insightful thing, and it's something that kind of gets lost in the analysis of Indiana, because when you try to break down Indiana through normal statistical means and even through advanced statistical means, that doesn't necessarily come out. But that 60 minutes of play, it has been, it's what won them the game at Iowa. It's what won them the game at Penn State, where, they frankly, I don't know if they took the foot off the gas per se, but they made a bunch of mistakes, and it really created problems. It's what won them the game against Ohio State. I mean, that is a killer instinct, and it's what you want out of a football team. And it is something that generally, if you have it, you can't really quantify it, but you can see it when it's happening. And that has been, as I reflect on it, probably the most distinguishing feature of this team that even last year's team didn't fully have.
Yep, absolutely, absolutely, Galen. I do want to answer your question though, which was what was in the Oregon game. I will say, Indiana, they from an EPA perspective, did not have the best rushing performance, and also did not have the best performance on early downs, which is going to be significant for the Miami game. So,
right,
they had a huge lead, but also, like we were just talking about, they are relentless. So you can take a little bit more away from some of these analytics and statistics in a blowout than maybe you could for another team. But yeah, that's the one thing I will say. And also how many yards after catch they surrendered. They surrendered 174 yards after the catch, which is also notable for this Miami game, which we'll get into later.
I mean, there are a couple of small things. I think you and I talked about this, where there's a couple of statistical anomalies, that might be too strong of a word, that came out of that Oregon game when you think about like what the yardage implications are. So for instance, like what was it? It was a 71-yard run by Hill, in the third quarter. That skewed a lot of the numbers. It was a huge explosive play, and it added a bunch of yardage that wouldn't have otherwise been there. You still have to count it, obviously, but that was so uncharacteristic from the rest of the game when you consider that, Hill's 4 other carries, he gained a total of 15 yards, and Oregon outside of that, I think, gained something like 50 total yards on the ground. And you still have to count those things, and Indiana is still prone to that. But there's little things like that I did notice when I was going back and looking at the statistics.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I will say it was really nice to see Elijah Surratt have a game like he had, which we kind of figured he might. He's really strong against man-to-man, which is not necessarily the case against Miami, though they'll run mostly zone. But it was good to see a performance from Elijah Surratt like that with was it eight catches, 121 yards and a touchdown. That's what you want to see from your top receiver in a game like that. And then I thought Roman Hemby had a really, really effective game, and which I thought he might with some of the zone concepts that they were going to run. It was just kind of hard to take too much away from that game as it progressed, but I thought those two really stood out to me.
Yeah.
I'll leave it there.
So let's dive into this game, and we can kind of let's start with the chart, as we always do. So I was surprised when it was an 80-20 split as far as this game was concerned in terms of your projections.
Me too.
Yeah, I mean, Indiana projected an 11.1 point differential in this game, and this is probably I don't know, this Miami team is such a curious statistical case, because they're clearly talented. They lost 2 games, but they were close in both of those games. But they've also won a lot of games that they were relatively close in, including the first and last playoff games that they played coming into this. They had to go to overtime to beat A&M. They obviously were right on the borderline of losing to Ole Miss, and even the Ohio State game. Ohio State had some advantages in that game that maybe didn't necessarily show up in the final score. But, you look at the comparison. FPI has Miami as 5th in the country, Indiana 1st. S&P Plus has Miami 9th in the country, Indiana 1st. FEI has Miami 6th in the country, Indiana 1st. So this is a top 10 matchup, and according to FPI, it's a top 5 matchup. So why is this in your statistical comparison an 80-20 split in favor of Indiana?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's I think so the win probability model that decided these percentages uses SP plus data, and so I think it first of all shows just how efficient and dominant Indiana has been, um, because of a difference between I think Indiana's first and Miami is ninth in those two metrics, and so the it's not even just the difference between the first place team and the ninth place team. It's just how far ahead Indiana is from the rest of the field, and the efficiency has it's been insane. I think that's kind of at the heart of it, Galen. But also, when you think about, I also think of, I've seen a lot of people compare a lot of people complain about the point spread, like how Indiana's a 7.5, depending on where you're looking, 7.5 or 8.5 point favorite. And I think a lot of that just happens to be how these teams profile too, and how similar they are, but also how different they are. And but yeah, I mean, I think overall, when you look at like Miami has played, they've played 5 games where their opponents had a 60% or higher post game win expectancy. That's 5 games of their 15. And they lost 2 of them. They won 3. 2 of them came in this in the college football playoff against Ohio State and Ole Miss. So I think you're looking at a Miami team, like you said, Galen, has played a lot of close games, has won a lot of close games, which they deserve credit for. But numbers don't really care about the credit. So,
Right.
It's like if you play, they haven't played down to all of their competition by any means. Like they beat Syracuse and several other teams. But when you are when you lose to SMU, you lose to Louisville. Like, I mean, those are 2 solid teams, but and then you play, Ole Miss, Ohio State, Notre Dame. When those teams statistically should have beaten you, that's not going to help with these efficiency numbers. So I think that's kind of the big thing, or the big set of variables.
Yeah, I mean, going back and looking at the chart, I mean, one of the things that sticks out to me. Let's start with Indiana's offense versus Miami's defense. What's Indiana's been very, very, very good all season in expected points added per play. They've gotten increasingly better at success in the passing game. Their conversion rates have been awesome. Their third down success is best in the country, and that's even despite their early down EPA not necessarily being as good now as it was earlier on, I think, in the year. And they face a Miami team that they're fine defensively, but they haven't really necessarily been able to stop teams moving the ball against them at anywhere close to the same level as what Indiana has done on their own defensive side, or compared to some of the other teams that Indiana has played so far this year, like Oregon, for instance. And so when you look at that matchup, offense versus defense, what's your how do you look at these and say, okay, where are the biggest advantages for Indiana, and where does maybe Miami's defense have some advantages going up against Indiana?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think the explosion rate is a big factor, especially because in the back half of the season, and I included this in the BSB, in the back half of the season, Indiana's passing game has actually been one of the top 10 explosive passing games, which I think most people, if you've watched Indiana football, would know, mostly because Charlie Becker's been the catalyst of a lot of that. But I will say too, and I looked this up. This is not in the BSB, but Fernando Mendoza, when he's attempting passes that are 20 or more yards downfield, he has the 7th lowest pressured rate. So it's not like he's holding on to the ball for a long time for these deep plays to occur, to convert them. He's getting rid of the ball quickly, and it's deep. And so that's people always think, in order to have deep passes, you have to let the plays develop. Well, they're not really doing that. They're getting the ball out. So, I think that's one advantage. And then, of course, like Miami's defensive line, like that's Corey Heatherman. I'm sure everyone knows at this point, but Corey Heatherman was the defensive coordinator under Curt Cignetti at James Madison from 2019 to 2021. His first defensive coordinator at James Madison, he picked Corey Heatherman. He has a lot of respect for Corey Heatherman. Bryant Haynes was an assistant under Heatherman. And so it makes sense that they would have a really similar philosophy on defense. And I think that's one of the more underrated stories. I think the biggest story of the national championship is Indiana football, of course. Like, of course. But I think one of the more underrated ones is that Corey Heatherman, in order to win the national championship, is going to have to beat people he cares about, people he's learned a lot from, especially Curt Cignetti. And so that, that'll be, I think that's a really interesting narrative with this game. But yeah, I think the defensive line of Miami is going to be a challenge, particularly the defensive ends. But I think this is like the biggest game. I'm quickly trying to think of the previous games, Galen, but this might be the biggest game in terms of how much Indiana is going to need Carter Smith.
Right.
I think Carter Smith is going to be a huge X factor in this game at left tackle for Indiana. So I think right tackle is interesting. Khalil Benson, not the best pass protector, but they're going to have to run the ball in order to win. So it's, because we talked about it before, like when Ajani came in at right tackle, he was in because he could pass block and he can run block too, but Khalil Benson only played 2 pass blocking snaps in that game. So, I think the tackle is going to be really interesting, but I think there's going to be something. I think Indiana is going to be able to get some ground in the rushing game on the interior. But yeah, I mean, these two teams, they're so similar in a lot of ways. And I think interior running game, strong defensive line is 2 of those.
Yeah, the matchup has gotten a lot of attention. The matchup between Miami's defensive line, their ends especially, and IU's offensive line. And it looked like, from looking at what we saw on film, that they like to line Bain up on what would be the equivalent of Indiana's right side, going up against Benson or Ajayi, and then would line Akeem Mesidor up on the side that Carter Smith's on. Now they could switch that around. They use a lot of wide 9 techniques, so they're getting almost like a straight angle off of the edge, trying to pull the offensive tackles away and back. And actually, you mentioned what's the gentleman's name again that you were talking about earlier, who had the tweet, Landon
Tengwell.
Landon Tengwell has actually a really good series of video breakdowns that go through exactly what Miami tries to do and what Indiana tries to do. I mean, Carter Smith's been great all year. I don't think he's allowed a sack on his side all season. It's been a little bit shakier on the right side, but again, Khalil Benson's been so great in run blocking, and Jai's been great not great, but really good in pass blocking. It is interesting. I will say this: as vaunted as Miami's pass rush has been made out to be, and they might end up being just as good in this game, but Mesidor has 10.5 sacks this season, and 3.5 of them have come in the playoffs. He had 1.5 against Texas A&M. He had 2 against Ohio State. He did not get home against Ole Miss. And there were some reasons for that, not the least of which was Trinidad Chambliss was scrambling out of the pocket, and they were using his mobility a little bit more in the running game. Ruben Bain, who I think has gotten more commentary, he has had 8.5 sacks this season, and 4 of them have come in the playoff. He had 3 against A&M. He had 1 against Ohio State, but again, had 0 against Ole Miss. So running the ball, does feel like it is something that, if Indiana can establish, takes away a bit of what Miami wants to do in terms of pressuring off the edge. Now, how well then does the interior of the line handle that? And what does Indiana decide to do in terms of pass or in terms of run blocking? You've talked a lot in Bite-Sized Bison about Indiana runs a lot of inside zone and runs a lot of duo, which is maybe like I was trying to look up like how to effectively explain inside zone versus duo. Inside zone is essentially where you're looking for a gap that opens, whereas duo is where you're going and trying to open the gap purposefully in one particular place, but you're still using essentially the same blocking techniques. Do I have that right, more or less?
Yeah. That's what makes duo kind of a mix between gap and zone. Yep. Yeah. Yep, but yeah, duo is mostly about trying to establish potential double teams on the interior offensive line, or if there isn't an assignment, the offensive lineman goes and takes the next level, a second level defender, and that should open up a hole. Kind of like if you think about it, kind of some sort of like weaving kind of technique that that is pretty effective at opening those interior gaps. And so, yeah, it's interesting. Indiana's been running a lot more duo, and sometimes it's kind of hard to tell, like on film, the difference between duo and inside zone. But they've been running a lot more duo in particular, and during the playoffs. So you can definitely see where Mike Shanahan like sat down in between the Big Ten championship and the playoff and was like, okay, we need to establish some new things about this offense, and he did it. Like the 6 offensive linemen packages, they've ran that 31 times in the two playoff games. And that's really helped. Zim Mikulski's had a couple of really solid performances in that role, and then a lot more interior zone rushing. And I think it's their 4th and 5th highest rate of interior zone rushing during the playoff over the course of the season. And so, they've I've made this point several times, but like if they're stretching the defense vertically, pulling a lot of the defenders away from the line of scrimmage with the explosive passing game, and then they're attacking the interior of the defense with the running attack. And so that's why they've been able to average 4.2 yards per carry in the postseason against some pretty strong, like pretty stout defenses, particularly Ohio State's and Oregon's. And so that's been really impressive to me. But this Miami team, Galen, and like kind of like you were explaining, when you line up really wide like that, you do leave yourself a bit more susceptible to like those interior rushes. And it's shown up in the data. Like the Alabama and Oregon and Ohio State all had better metrics against those interior zone rushes than Miami. And Miami has surrendered yards on the ground in those concepts to the Texas A&M ran 17 times in the interior with zone, and they averaged 3.6 yards a carry, which is about where Miami is at. They rank 58th in how many yards per carry they surrender on interior zone rushes. And then against Ole Miss, Ole Miss ran 7 times with interior rushing and interior zone rushing concepts, and they averaged 13 yards a carry on those 7. And so I think part of that's an explosive carry, but the what those two teams were able to do, Ohio State essentially went away from the running attack because they were down early, and so they only ran the ball 19 times in total, and which I don't know if that was wise because they weren't really down by a lot. Like they could have. Well, but with Julian saying, his whole thing was that he wasn't good under pressure. So why, I don't really fully understand.
I mean, I popped the chart that you put up. I still don't understand what Ohio State was doing in this game.
The game script, like they got down 14-0 and they just stopped. They didn't run. Galen, it's actually really interesting. They started throwing so much that their average late down distance was 8 yards. I don't know what they were doing either.
I mean, obviously Jeremiah Smith had a great game, but that was about it. And no, that one is still a head scratcher when you go back, and it's a game where Ohio State outgained Miami 332 to 291.
Yeah.
It's a game where, and this is where, when we wind around to Miami's offense versus Indiana's defense, it is a game that fell into the pattern that Miami likes, which is they took an early lead and then they just ground clock down and ended up having a 7-minute advantage in time of possession over Ohio State. So that's where, from an Indiana perspective, you got to get the run game going. And as you said, there's certainly the way Indiana runs, it's like specifically tailor-made to battle really wide, line alignments from the defensive ends. And the linebacking core is not as impressive for Miami as the defensive ends are. So, look, the interior of the line, Pat Coogan, Bray Lynch, Drew Evans, I think they're really going to have to hold their own against who they're going up against in the interior defensive line. And it also feels like in passing situations for Indiana, this is where Roman Hemby and Kalon Black are really going to have to be positioned exactly right for when Indiana does pass the ball, where they can give that extra half second to let Fernando Mendoza uncork it. Now, Rhett Lewis brought this up when I was talking with him earlier, and it's a question mark. Miami's missing a key piece in the secondary for the first half because of a targeting penalty. You've got 3 bona fide stars at receiver in Elijah Surratt and Omar Cooper Jr. and Charlie Becker. But as you pointed out in Bite Size Bison, you have a zone killer in EJ Williams Jr., who's been specifically deployed in that sort of a circumstance. So going back to our conversation about always putting relentless pressure on the opponent, you're going to have the freedom of Miami being down a defensive back, a cornerback in the first half. So what do you do strategically if you're Mike Shanahan and Kurt Signetti in terms of trying to best take advantage of that circumstance?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're going to see some deep shots. I think you're going to see deep shots in the first half. I think they're definitely going to try to convert. It's not like Miami's defensive backs have been fantastic all season anyway. It's kind of been a bit of a weak spot for them. And so, you could definitely create some one-on-one matchups in this scenario. And that's all Mike Shanahan really wants to do. He's not necessarily trying to scheme receivers open. He's trying to scheme receivers into one-on-one situations because Charlie Becker and Elijah Surratt, like good luck, good luck keeping them from catching the ball. Even EJ Williams, profile against zone coverage is so interesting, Galen. He leads the team in targets against zone coverage. This is according to Sports Info Solutions. And so, it's like 70% of his targets, and they haven't faced a ton of zone. It's been a good amount of man. And so, I'm curious to see, how that is worked out, because usually for this team to have EJ Williams on the field, it requires taking Charlie Becker off. And I don't know if they want to do that. And so because I think if you have Charlie Becker on the field, it requires some extra attention from Miami to prevent that explosion, especially in the first half. So it's one of those things, Galen, where you present that threat, they have to account for it. Maybe you can just get some chunk yardage on the ground. You don't necessarily need to, throw a ton in the first half, but it's going to be felt in the amount of ground they surrender in the run game. But I mean, you can go over that defensive front, and I think that'll be very interesting. I think Omar Cooper, I think back to in the Notre Dame game, the college football playoff game, what they did was they didn't necessarily throw deep downfield. They just got behind Indiana's front, their aggressive front, and then forced the defensive backs to tackle their receivers. I could see Omar Cooper getting a lot of targets in that situation. Indiana hasn't played a lot of defensive fronts that are like Miami's. Mm-hmm. And so if you can, we've seen Omar Cooper get a lot of short field targets. I could see that happening just because of what he can do after the catch. Riley Nowakowski is another one of those. I think there's going to be a big yak play from either of those guys, maybe both of them, in that scenario, just getting behind the defensive front.
Yeah. I'm fascinated to find out what Indiana decides to do in terms of their run pass balance and how they try to get things started. And it will be, if Indiana can establish the run early, it opens up so many other things. But I also think if they can establish pass protection and do what they did, frankly, against both Alabama and Oregon, but especially Alabama, and they were able to invite pressure on Fernando Mendoza, and then he carved them up with passes in the intermediate range. A lot of that to Riley Nowakowski and Omar Cooper, and that's been he's gotten so good at that. And what makes this one unique is like Miami does blitz some. They like to get a lot of pressure off of that front four and then sit back in a zone shell. But if they blitz, he's gotten so good at recognizing that and knowing that he's going to be getting a ton of pressure off of each edge. I think perhaps gives him a little even greater cognizance of when there is a blitz coming, he's going to know, okay, I've got to hot route this out as quickly as possible, as opposed to getting kind of suckered in to the times when he's almost sat in the pocket a little bit too long or tried to make something happen. This is definitely one of those games where you want to just live for another down rather than trying to force something or taking a sack and putting yourself off schedule too much.
Yep. No, I agree. And the way that he's been using his legs too has been really interesting. He's been carrying the ball a lot more during the playoff, which I found to be another dynamic added to this offense, as if they needed another one. I think that's that's a really good thought, Galen. The zone defense from Heatherman too. It's not consistent zone. Like he'll switch between man and zone, and I think identifying those plays when you're against man coverage, I think Mendoza's also become very good at identifying that as well pre-snap, and if you can get in those scenarios, like that is ideal too. But I don't know how often Heatherman's going to try to do that against this receiving core.
Yeah, I mean, when everybody's hitting on all cylinders, this is just such a tough offense to play against. And I mean, it's where the innate advantage is for Indiana in this game, is that they don't have to necessarily lean on one part of their game. It's just, and this is where I go back to the Ohio State game, because I think Alabama they proved themselves very incapable of stopping what Indiana was doing from the beginning. And then Oregon, pretty much the same thing. I mean, as much as we talked about the first true Oregon drive, not the pick six, but they had a chance to make a statement in that game, and they just let Indiana methodically march right down the field and essentially do whatever they wanted until Indiana scored a touchdown, and that set the tone for the rest of the game. It does feel like tone setting early is going to be important for both of these teams, and I do think that Miami has a greater chance of tone setting defensively because they don't play offense in a way that necessarily tone sets. That's not what they're about. Like and maybe this is a good chance for us to transition over to Miami offense versus Indiana defense. I'll call the chart back up. Again, it's kind of jarring when you look at Miami being 41st in the country on the season in EPA per play.
Yeah.
And a lot of that is because of the relatively low success rate in the running game, the lack of explosive plays. But then this is also a team that's won as many games as they have. They've won 13 games so far on the season. And then you look at what Indiana's been able to do in terms of keeping their opponents from racking up a lot of EPA per play. It looks like a good setup for Indiana, but to go back to the point that I was making, Miami's not a team that hits a lot of home run balls. They're a team that really likes to play a more methodical style. They like to chew clock. They like to gradually move their way down the field, and it grinds their opponents down. They were able to do that very well against teams in the ACC. This is a better team than what they've played on the balance of the season. So it's like, I don't know if they're going to be able to hit the home run that they would need at the early to set the tone on offense, given what Indiana's defense has proven that they can do.
It is interesting, Galen. I think, the thing that their offense likes to do, if they do any tone setting, it's that they like to run at you. And so they'll run in the interior about as much as Indiana does. And if it's not a run in the interior, it's a sweep with Malachi Toney or something like that, with Mark Fletcher and Shamar Brown. I think it's the what they like to do is they like to run in the interior and then spread defenses out horizontally with screens and a short passing game. Carson Beck is actually real inefficient on any pass that's deeper than 9 yards. He's completed 52% of his passes if it's further than 9 yards downfield, and ranks. He's graded 88th on explosive deep balls 20 yards downfield. He just does. He's really efficient with quick release balls, and he throws 8 screens a game. That's the nature of this passing offense. And so they'll spread a team and make them accountable horizontally, and then run on the interior with some really physical running. But that's what Bryant Haynes' defense is kind of built to stop in a lot of ways. They, especially on the interior, this is a defense that attacks from the interior. Running on the interior against Indiana is very difficult. They measure one of the top 2-3 defenses on defending the run on the interior, but that's a lot of what Miami does. And so you find yourself running into the strength or the point of attack from Bryant Haynes' defense. And then Bryant Haynes' passing defense is not necessarily stopping the ball at the point of the catch. Is more if the ball does get out because they bring pressure, it's more the defensive backs or the linebackers getting the receiver on the ground if the ball is caught, being physical at the point of the catch and then getting them on the ground. So they surrender. I think it's the second least amount of yards after catch in total in the country. By catch, it's like 14th in the country. And so they, we talk about how that matches up with Miami's offense. It's kind of the toughest, like, philosophical matchup that Miami has had offensively. I think the biggest thing is going to be stopping that physical running attack. And that's that they run with high volume, the second highest volume that Indiana's seen this season. I think, but I will say a 5 defensive back set does give this offense issues because you are able to cover a lot of the ground horizontally and against the passing attack, and then your front 7 can then blanket the interior rushing game. They actually have negative EPA throughout the playoff in each of their playoff games, negative EPA when running the ball into 5 defensive back sets. So I think Devin Boykin's going to be an X factor on defense. I think you'll see him on the field a lot.
Feels like the linebackers are really going to be key for Indiana in this one as well. I mean, because that's what has been so impressive about how Indiana has deployed and utilized their linebackers in the running game, and defending the running game, has been how quickly Isaiah Jones and Aiden Fisher in particular have been able to plug holes. And that, we've heard a lot about the size of Miami's defensive or offensive line. And, if you've got a big offensive line, you're going to want to use them to run the ball, which explains a lot of the volume. But making tackles at the line of scrimmage and penetrating the backfield as much as possible and making it difficult is a really good way to get Miami behind schedule. And then they have to throw into the teeth of the defensive backs. And that is difficult for anybody to do, as we've seen throughout the course of this season. It's just a lot of it is, can you be physical enough to not allow a lot of yards after contact, to get guys down early? And can you get penetration on that offensive line in a way that snuffs out the run even before it gets started?
Yep. No, exactly. And what Miami has done, I believe it was against Ohio State and Ole Miss. Ohio State and Texas A&M, is they ran the ball on early downs and then passed on late downs. And so it was actually really interesting because they didn't record a whole lot of EPA because they didn't run in high leverage situations on the ground. So they might have a low EPA or a low success rate just because they didn't run in high leverage situations. They used the running game to get Carson Beck into better position to convert those like third or fourth downs. And he converted 2 third downs on the drive that moved their lead to 24-14 over Ohio State. And so that's also significant as well. Like you were saying, Galen, you have to stop that physical rushing game to get them off of schedule, which seems obvious to say, but it's also like when you look at the numbers is like very clear. Like they will turn to that very early in series. And then it was almost like clockwork in those 2 games that they would turn to Carson Beck and the athleticism, the horizontal athleticism of the receiving core on third and fourth down. So that was really interesting to me. But yeah, if they can, and like you were saying with the linebackers, we haven't seen a game where these linebackers weren't up for the test. And right. So that's kind of what gives me some confidence, is that, these linebackers have been solid against every opponent that Indiana has played. I don't think you can really find a game where any of the linebackers were consistently bad in the matchup. And so I think Bryant Haynes being a linebackers coach also has a lot to do with that. He knows, one of the points of one of the main points of an offensive scheme is getting the linebackers in conflict. And so Bryant Haynes is really good at keeping his linebackers out of a defensive position, more in an attacking position. And the simulated pressure and everything goes along with that, which I am curious to see if that bothers Carson Beck, who's in his 7th year of college football, because it has feasted on less experienced quarterbacks. But there's I just threw a lot at you, but
no, I mean I think it's all really important factors, because ultimately what Indiana is going to have to do is, here's the thing with Beck. Is Beck going to beat you by himself? Probably not. That's not how this Miami offense is set up. But as we saw in that Ole Miss game, Beck can make plays. Like, Beck has been a kind of a punching bag for a lot of people, and I think it's easy to try to graft an idea that he's somehow not a good player on top of that, and I think that's a mistake. He's a savvy player. He's been around a lot. He really hasn't made a ton of mistakes that have resulted in turnovers lately, but he's also not a guy who's carrying the offense. And I think what Indiana wants to do is put him in a position where he has to carry the offense, where he has to be the vehicle through which Miami's offense is conducting itself. They really haven't had a game like that all season. And I don't, to some degree, it's been the thing I've been most impressed about with Miami is that it's no surprise what Miami wants to do offensively.
Yep.
And not really many teams have managed to completely throw them off of that. And looking at the numbers, you're like, well, Indiana feels like they're not going to say tailor-made to throw them off of what they're doing. But when you look at what, Miami offensively has done over the course of the season, only 3 teams have kept them from rushing for at least 130 yards all season. One of them was Florida State at Florida State, which was a closer game than I think we gave it credit for when it happened. One of them was Louisville in Miami, who held them to 63 yards on 24 carries. It was also a weirdly low rushing total for Miami in that game in terms of total carries. And then the other one was Virginia Tech, who allowed only 83 yards. It's just that Virginia Tech could do nothing on offense themselves, and that was a game where Carson Beck, I think, was able to take advantage of inefficiencies in the other aspects of Virginia Tech's defense to make things happen. But that's the kind of the task for Indiana here is, can you keep them from scoring on the ground? Can you keep them from racking up a lot of numbers on the ground? And can you put the ball in Carson Beck's hands and say, okay, now you got to beat us going that direction without overcommitting to the box to stopping the run? Like, that becomes the balance that Bryant Haynes, it feels like, has to hit.
Yeah. There's something I included in the BSB, Galen, was a graphic that showed the per touch, how many yards were gained either after the catch or after contact. And the teams that, and it seems really obvious, but the teams that put themselves in the best position to beat Miami were the teams that limited both of those phases, because 50% of Miami's rushing yards in the playoff have come after contact from Mark Fletcher. And that's just Mark Fletcher. That's not Shamar Brown. And so, if you can tackle effectively and prevent yards after catch and yards after contact, that's a big deal. The yards after contact is the one that's been a bit more reliable. Like, limiting yards after contact for Miami will put you in a good spot. Like we were just talking about earlier, getting them off schedule, not allowing Fletcher or Brown to get yards, I guess, after contact, like getting them on the ground, tackling well. But sometimes, though, there were some teams that did limit the yards after contact, but surrendered too many yak. And so, and that's like you were saying, Galen, like making Carson Beck in the passing game beat you, which is interesting because Malachi Toney is a receiver on this team. Like that guy is very dangerous.
Yeah.
And he had explosive play. Like, they had 2 explosive plays that gave them the lead twice against Ole Miss. And
Mhm.
so, like you were saying, like it's not necessarily that they're like a multiple offense. It's more that this is who they are. And as I described it in the BSB, it's like trying to plug 6 holes with 5 fingers, like
Right.
6 holes in a dam with 5 fingers. Like one's gonna start flooding, and so how do you blanket all of that is a huge task for any defense. I think even Indiana's defense might struggle at times.
Yeah, I mean, but Tony is such a talented player. 99 catches this season, 1,089 yards, 9 touchdowns, uh, 6.6 receptions a game. I mean, like just there's so many things. But it's interesting is he is so heavily targeted.
Yeah.
Like this feels like we're obviously. I'm assuming we're going to see D'Angelo Pons on Malachi Tony. A lot, and that this is actually one of those rare instances where there isn't really a size disadvantage for D'Angelo Pons against Malachi Tony because Tony's only 5'11".
Mm-hmm.
So that's another interesting wrinkle in this particular matchup, given how good D'Angelo Pons is at covering the other team's best receiver. We saw him do it against Jeremiah Smith. We've seen him do it against several other like really highly regarded receivers throughout the course of the year.
Yeah, but I will say, Galen, as much as we're talking, with some confidence about the defense, like this is what Miami does. Like
Right.
they get 9.7 yards per screen to Malachi Tony. Like that, teams know it's coming and
Right.
it still works. Like that's a huge factor now that they get. I mean, they get like it's like something like 6 yards per 6 yards after the catch per reception. Like that, I and Malachi Tony is a lot of that. Like he's caught like the third most screens in college football, and he's very dynamic in the way that they get him the ball. I don't know if you can just put D'Angelo Pons on Malachi Tony with the way that he's moved around the defense. Like he might get in a matchup with like Jamari Sharp or Devin Boykin. Like that's not ideal. Like I think you'd like to have D'Angelo Pons on him, especially because they put D'Angelo Pons on offenses that he had the best east-west speed on the team. Like that's the type of guy that you want defending Malachi Tony. But Malachi Tony is just so good. Again, like you were saying, in the playoff, he has the biggest target share on his team, and his EPA per reception is almost equal to Omar Cooper's.
Yeah.
Like it's wild. So like. Yeah, it's like we're identifying these things. We're saying this matchup seems to work for Indiana, but also Miami has just been super effective at this, and that's why they're why they're in this game.
Well, and it brings up kind of the last major point I wanted to hit with you, which is the X factor for Miami feels like their athleticism and their physicality at multiple positions, and this is where. This has not really hurt Indiana this season. And obviously, they just played an Oregon team that is replete with 4 and 5 stars. They played an Ohio State team that is replete with really high-level athletic talent. They played an Alabama team that's replete with 5 stars. But, Miami is just as athletically gifted as any of those teams. They haven't been as overwhelming statistically. But if you're an IU fan, I say this as an IU fan and commentator, I'm buoyed by the fact that Indiana has played as well as they have against players of this athletic caliber. But it's always something you worry about, especially when you're playing that team on their home field, about how do you measure up when you are. I mean, a lot of Indiana's the execution's been great, the production's been great, but you are still dealing with some physical measurable deficiencies, and you have to overcome that through really solid technique and execution.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the first thing I think of when I think of that is not necessarily Miami's rushing game and their physical running backs, but I'll talk about that in a second. But Bryant Haynes' style of scheming his defensive line. They're not the biggest defensive linemen, but the stunts and the actions, the simulated pressure or the blitzing from the linebackers, like how he gets creative with that is I saw somewhere online that they're PFF. I saw somebody use PFF data to say they have the 10th highest stunt rate on the defensive line, and so they just use a lot of movement. So you can say Miami's offensive line is big. That's great, but it's the scheme that makes this defensive front so effective, and they're very athletic, very laterally quick, and not a lot of teams have been able to beat that. And so I think that's a good question, Galen, and it goes to the point where Miami's offensive line is one of the best that Indiana has played. Is this the offensive line that does stop some of that stunting and maybe that scheming doesn't quite work against? We saw some of that last year, but this is a different defensive line. But I will say with Miami's running attack too, I've seen a lot of Miami fans look at the last 2 games that Indiana has played and their rushing attack, that the rushing attacks that they've played. Alabama is just not good at all. Plus, Jan Miller wasn't super healthy, and then the issues that running back for Oregon, it was used to downplay Indiana's running defense, but their running defense is legitimately good. But I also think that is somewhat of a good point too, because this is the best rushing attack in terms of health, in terms of ability that Indiana will have seen during the playoff. And so I think there is something to that. This like Miami, they're 5th in broken tackles. They're 10th in yards after contact. Like that's a lot of that is just because they run the ball a lot, but also they're just a tough running team. Yeah. And so I think those are 2 things that go with your point, Galen, about the physical talent. I think defensive ends as well. That it's going to be a challenge.
All that said, when you look at Indiana's season, they've only given up triple-digit rushing yards twice.
Yeah.
One of those was Penn State, who still only ran for 117 yards and 3.5 yards per carry.
That's probably the most comparable backfield to this one that Indiana played.
Yeah. But I think even that game, I think it's important to remember that it wasn't like Penn State ran all over them all game.
Yeah.
Penn State picked up some yards in the second half, but a lot of that was there were some turnover related items there that Indiana dealt with as well. The other game that Indiana allowed triple-digit rushing yards was Old Dominion, but that was kind of a special case because it was basically 2 runs accounting for 150 yards essentially, and you still count that, but nothing like that's happened since then. And so, and it's also like Miami wants to gain 4 or 5 yards a carry. They don't necessarily run the ball to get explosives. They're running the ball to wear you out as the game goes along. And
they're like 112th in rushes of 20 plus yards. Like they do not get explosion from the rushing attack, except against Texas A&M apparently.
Yeah, that was a weird game all the way around. And they get the explosives there, and then they don't score.
Yeah, right.
So I guess wrapping up. I mean, anything else in terms of this matchup, in terms of the location? It's on natural grass. I think it's on natural grass. Is Hard Rock natural grass?
I actually don't know.
I've been thinking that all week. What's this? Hard Rock Stadium playing surface. What is it? It is natural grass.
Okay.
So often grown at a dedicated sod farm. So there you go. And this was actually something I was worried about with the Rose Bowl, also played on natural grass. Mm-hmm. And that was a very wet field that ended up not being a problem at all. Indiana did not have any issues with running or cutting on that. This is from the weather forecast that I'm seeing, it's not going to be wet in Miami. It might be a little on the chilly side in the evening for Miami I'm saying like mid 50s in Miami, but it doesn't feel like the playing surface is going to be that big of a deal. And Indiana's already run on natural grass now, so that's not that much of an issue. I mean, anything else factor-wise you think that we need to be keeping an eye on in this game for either team?
Yeah, I think Indiana just playing cleanly. I said it before the last game. If they could play clean against Oregon, that was going to go a long way. And of course it did. Like Oregon helped a lot in that regard. In terms of the turnovers, not that it was Oregon that handed the ball over, except for the one with the running back issue, like Dante Moore bringing his arm back. That was really the only one that was more Indiana not causing it. The other ones were Indiana causing it, the block punt and everything. Yeah. But I think Miami is 132nd, ranked 132nd in penalties. Like they commit a ton of penalties, and that was clear in the games that they lost this season too. They had 12. I think that was against SMU. They had 12 penalties. I think 9 in the other one. So I think penalties are a big factor. I think turnovers are, of course, going to be a big factor. But you're laughing, Galen.
Well, I looked at the penalty thing earlier this week. It's actually, I think it's funny on a couple of levels. You're right. So they committed 13 penalties against Florida State for 114 yards, 9 against Louisville, 12 against SMU. They committed 10 against Ole Miss and nearly lost the game.
Mm-hmm.
They only had one game all year where they didn't commit a single penalty.
Ohio State.
It's like the gods smiled on Miami in that game on a number of levels. That's wild that they committed 0 penalties in that game.
I'm sure Ohio State fans are very happy to see that too, after how long they went without holding penalties. I think turnovers are a big deal in this too. The 2 games that Miami lost, they lost the turnover differential. So I think and they've won games where they lost turnover differential too, but I think that's notable. And then also Miami they've missed some field goals. They've hit 75% of their field goals. Indiana has not had that problem. That 75% ranks 76th in the country in field goal percentage. Also, a couple statistical records for Indiana that I wasn't aware of. Right now, Nico Radicic is tied with Griffin Oaks' 2015 season for the best field goal percentage. So if he hits a field goal in this one and doesn't miss one, he's gonna own that record for single season field goal percentage. And then also Elijah Surratt is 1 touchdown reception away from tying James Hardy's single season record set in 2007. Elijah Surratt has 15 right now. The record's 16. So I thought those 2 things were really interesting. But
there was only one game. Well, there were 2 games this year that Miami lost the turnover battle and didn't lose the game. One of them was Florida earlier this year.
That was an interesting game.
That was. Yeah, if you go back and watch it, you get a little bit of a head scratcher. And then the other one was the Ole Miss game where they were -1 and still managed to pull it off. So
this playoff run by them has been real interesting. And just how they've gotten by the skin of their teeth, and that's how that's going to have to be with Indiana too. You can't really count them out. I'm probably still going to be pretty nervy going into the game. Like I was nervous in the last one in a lot of ways, but this one I bet is going to be very similar in that way.
Yeah, it's I mean, going back to your kicking point, Carter Davis is 17 of 23 on the season.
Mm-hmm.
So that's not a great number. His long is 49 on the year. Bert Auburn, who I think is their kickoff specialist, has kicked 1 field goal on the season. And actually, I'm sorry, it's Carter Davis does not have a long of 49. I screwed that up. His long, what is his long on the season? I actually can't find it. Never mind. But yeah, I mean, six missed field goals is not insignificant and something to keep in mind. And again, it's like this is where Indiana, you want to get Miami into situations where they stall out in the red zone and have to kick field goals, because as much as they want to chew you up and wear your defensive front down, if you can keep them from capitalizing with 7 points off of that, that's essentially what SMU and Louisville were able to do in the 2 games that they won against Miami.
Yeah. And Galen, the last thing that I'll add too is the red zone. Like Miami has been really effective in the red zone offensively, and not necessarily in terms of touchdowns, but in success rate. That I think they're like 29th in touchdown rate. So that's not super impressive. It's good, but it's not super impressive. But their scoring rate is pretty good. And then Indiana is the best defensive red zone team in the country, which is really interesting because that was an area that Curt Cignetti told Bryant Haynes that he needed to figure out between seasons. I remember Bryant Haynes saying that, one of those under the hood interviews with Rhett Lewis. And he figured it out. They're the best defensive team in the red zone. So I think that matchup, the Miami offense versus the Indiana defense in the red zone. I remember, I've referred to this a few times on Crimson Cast, which is, Indiana might surrender some yardage in the middle of the field not often, but they might at times. But they really tighten up as the field gets shorter. And so I think that's something to really keep an eye out for too. Is that red zone matchup in particular?
Yeah, Miami offensively on the season has their conversion in all games in the red zone is only 88.7% for scoring, only 67.7% for touchdowns. And you look at what they've done this season, it's actually been the one thing in the playoffs that hasn't worked that well for them. Is
Oh, for real? I didn't see that.
they against A&M, they were 2 for 3 in scoring in the red zone, but only scored 1 touchdown. They had a 33% conversion rate there. Against Ohio State, they were 2 for 3. They did score 2 touchdowns there. Against Ole Miss, they were 3 for 4, but only scored 2 touchdowns in those 3 possessions.
Okay.
Now, defensively, Miami, they've held opponents to only scoring 53% of touchdowns in the red zone on those opportunities, and that has been impressive so far in the playoffs. So A&M was 1 for 3 overall in the red zone, didn't score a touchdown. Ohio State was 2 for 3 and scored 2 touchdowns, and Ole Miss did not score a touchdown in their single red zone possession. It's hard to believe they only had one red zone possession the entire game, which says something about how much Ole Miss scored as many points as they did.
Yeah.
But that is perhaps worth keeping an eye on. And you compare it to what Indiana's done in the red zone so far this season, and offensively, Indiana's scoring touchdowns on 74% of their red zone opportunities, while surrendering only 35% of touchdowns to their opponent in red zone visits. So yeah, I think you could say Brian Haynes tightened it up a little bit.
Yeah, they're insane defensively in the red zone. It's nuts. But I will say, Galen, and this kind of touches on this too, is that when you look at it requires further investigation. All of their season-long metrics, all of Miami's season-long metrics require further investigation because they're outperforming a lot of their season-long metrics.
Yes.
And they're finding an identity, like you were saying earlier, with the defensive ends getting the sacks so late in the season. You could say the same about the rushing attack and its effectiveness. I think, I don't think the rushing attack is as effective as Miami fans are as loud about it.
Right.
I don't think it's that good, but it is high in volume and it has made big plays for them. And it has put them in situations where they can make big plays. And so I think, this Miami team is I don't want to say overperforming. They're outperforming their season-long metrics, which is another reason why it's tough to count them out. When you look at that 80% win probability, it's like that's a big percentage, but that 20% is certainly there too. So they're underdogs in SP Plus in all of their playoff matchups too. So
that's the thing. They've been underdogs before. This has been the toughest thing for me to get my head wrapped around. And if I sound a little nervous, I get nervous before every game, folks. I don't get nervous before the playoff games. I get nervous before every game. And it just starts a lot earlier when they're in the playoffs. But I'll say what has been giving me pause about feeling overly confident about Indiana has been, I think you said it perfectly. They have overperformed their season performances. Their playoff performances, they have found ways to win. I won't say they're a team of destiny because I don't really believe in that, but they have played above what their station looked like it was going to be going into the playoff. And that's always concerning when you have a talented team, because we see this in every sport. If you put it together at the right time, you can play a lot better than whatever you were playing as before, because now you're fully tapping your potential, whereas before perhaps you were not. And I think you could make an argument Ohio State did that last year to some degree in the playoff, where they underperformed a little bit leading into it, and then they found their full stride. But this is not a team that has the cast of characters that Ohio State had last year. They've got some really good players, but much like you were talking about, their rushing attack probably isn't as good as Miami fans claim that it is. I think the same is about the pass rush. Like, the pass rush is playing really good right now, but the numbers don't bear out that it is this like world-beating pass rush it's been world beating in some of the playoff games, but that's different. And then it becomes the question of, well, is that a product of it being the team playing at a really high level, or have they taken advantage of certain matchup deficiencies that the other team gave them? And that becomes the big operative question in this game. And that's what we don't know. And that's what makes this fun, is trying to divine that. The Miami running attack is not a sharp weapon. It's a grinding machine. It is intended to get with longevity. It's a distance runner. It's not a sprinter. It's intended to get with longevity what it can't get through explosiveness. And Indiana has not played a lot of teams like that so far this season, and I am very interested to see what they do. But this is where Indiana has to take advantage of their offensive advantages in this game and put Miami in a position where, much as you were talking about with Oregon, they can't lean on the run. They can't afford to sit there and grind out 7, 8, 9-minute possessions. That to me feels as much a key to Indiana's victory in this as anything else.
Yeah, and I'll say something to Galen is that Indiana they've evolved as an offense and as a defense, obviously, because they lost their tight ends and they had to go to a 3-man defensive line for a second. But the offense has evolved. It just in that, just in the graphic in BSB, I show like the rates at which they ran that interior zone rush. And when you compare the Oregon games, they didn't run any duo at all. And their rate was way lower, just interior zone rushes in general, in week 7 versus the college football playoff. And that, first of all, that shows the evolution of the offense, but also it shows the many ways that this offense can win. So and the reason why I'm saying this is because if the pass rush is effective and they find it hard to throw deep, they played half their season where they didn't throw deep without Charlie Becker, so there is a capability of Indiana playing the short passing game with a whole cast of characters, like you were saying, and that still opens up some room on the inside. So the offense, the offense is actually kind of what I'm not as worried about. I'm more worried about the defense, which is interesting because it's Brian Haynes' defense that has been so consistent.
Right.
But it is down 2 defensive ends, and it hasn't gotten that same type of pressure that we've come to know Brian Haynes of scheming. And we talk about that Oregon game in week 7, how often they sacked Dante Moore. We haven't seen that at the same sort of clip. It still has been there, but it's not the same clip and not the same caliber. So, I think that there are some points of concern. There are some points of confidence as well. And I'm pretty confident on the offensive side.
I agree with everything you said. However, I will also say that in the last 4 games of the regular season, Indiana accrued a total of 5 sacks. In the 2 playoff games, without Stephen Daly or Kellen Wyatt, they've accrued 6 sacks. So
they only had 5 sacks at the end of the regular season.
They had zero against Maryland, 2 against Penn State, 2 against Wisconsin, and 1 against Purdue.
Wow. Okay. All right. Well, that gives me a little bit more confidence.
So just keep that in mind. Now, it's funny because they did have 5 against Ohio State, and Miami also feasted on Ohio State, which might say more about Ohio State than it does about either Indiana or Miami.
Yeah. When you look at those 2 games, Galen, I keep these like EPA roundups or like I call them EPA roundups, and Indiana's defensive performance against Ohio State was amazing. Yeah. Like 30, like the percentile for Ohio State's EPA per play against Indiana compared to Miami was 30 percentile less than what it was against Miami. The defensive performance was outstanding, and Miami wasn't bad against Ohio State's offense either. Indiana was that good, and so I think it says a lot about Ohio State offensively, especially.
Taylor, this has been a pleasure. Amazing work by you on all of these prep materials and a great bite-sized Bison to close out the season. We'll look forward to chatting with you about this game a lot before it happens, probably while it's happening, and certainly afterwards. And thank you for everything you've done for the IU football community.
Yeah, I appreciate that, Galen. Yeah, I love this football program. I love the story. Like the people ask me, like I grew up a reversible jacket fan up in Northeast Indiana, and when I went to Indiana, when I got accepted in Indiana, I started watching IU football in 2013, and then I got to campus in 2014. Went to my first game. It was the Indiana State game, and there was like hardly anybody in the stands, and I was like, man, this is mine. Like this is like I feel like this is mine. Like it wasn't pretty. Like they won like 28-0 or 28-10 or something like that against Indiana State. And I was like, but yeah, I love Shane Wynn. I love Tevin Coleman. Like this feels like it's mine. And so I just kind of, and then once I was really covering the team, starting the midway through that season and on, I was like, I just fell in love with the story of Indiana football. I don't have the same emotional ties that multi-generation IU fans have, but what I do feel really closely tied to is that story and how, dating back to before I even started watching the football program and stuff, like you going to what was it, like 66-0 loss against Wisconsin or something. What was that score, Galen?
Which one? 62-14, watching the 83-20 game on television.
Yeah.
Broadcasting Indiana losing at Michigan 58-0 in 2000. I've seen things, man. I know.
Things.
The cool thing about this, I think, and you coming to it, obviously, when you did, this is something Connor and I talked about earlier. It feels like for the longest time, it felt like being an IU football fan was like being part of a really exclusive fraternity, but like an off-campus fraternity, not one that people wanted to join, but one that like was on the outside of the social fringes, and you really had to have a certain willingness to deal with the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune if you were going to sustain in this fandom. And so it's been delightful watching so many people now flocking to it and watching it having the success that it has. And I'm glad it's brought you the same level of joy it's brought me.
Yeah. I'm happy I could be a part of it too. And thanks for, platforming the newsletter and everything, and also being my professor when I was, when I was learning how to cover football teams. And so, yeah, no, if things go well on Monday, this is like, it might already be like the greatest story in sports. Like I can't, there are a lot of great stories in sports, of course, but this is up there. This is with them.
Taylor Lehman of Bite Size Bison, thank you again for joining us, and thanks to all you folks. We gave you, I think this is our longest BSB Crimson Cast preview ever.
I apologize.
No, this is give the people what they want, and the people want this, and I wanted it as well. So thanks to you folks. We'll have a bit more coverage from Miami. This is our last podcast before I take the Bison airlift and bring the Bison to South Beach, as they would say. But stay tuned. I'll have content out on the Substack. I'll have some content out on YouTube. I'll have some content out on X, obviously. Follow myself, Alex Paul, Mitchell Page driving down. He's part of the Stampede as well. And, of course, the whole Back Home Network crew bringing you the coverage you're looking for. Scott's going to be down there as well. We're looking forward to seeing so many of you down there. We'll see you at our event Sunday night. We'll see you at the event Monday. We'll see you at Hard Rock Stadium. Again, for Taylor Lehman, I'm Galen Clavio. Thank you for joining us here on Crimson Cast. Thank you to Home Field. Thank you to Modelo. Thank you to Posh Hotel Bloomington. Couple sleeps left, folks, and we'll get to see Indiana play for a national championship. We'll catch you folks on the flip side. Stay never daunted. So long, everybody.